is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal Newshour. I got chit-chatting and with Will from The Living Joke, and I did not set up all my links, but I'm almost done. There is so much happening in the world today. It's a little frightening, a little scary, but we're going to walk our way through it because there's so much going on. It's Greenland, it's Iran, it's Minnesota, it's everything. Twitter has been it's been a fun day on Twitter today. Just everybody freaking out about the potential end of NATO, if things with Denmark go the wrong way over Greenland, whether we actually need Greenland. It just goes on and on and on and on. And on top of that, you have the Iranians calling for the return of the Shah, which I never thought would happen, especially given our interview last week with Zolal Habibi, who talked about that they were not a lot of not a lot of a love for the Shah for obvious reasons, and that is a whole thing. So we're going to dive into that. It's also we're also going to get into a new article from the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, talking about Pete Hegseth's Christian nationalist crusade to remake the military, which was going on long before Mr. Hegseth came along, and that's a whole a whole thing. We're going to get into a little video from Midas Touch about what Greenland all means, and a big intelligence snafu that kind of also impacts uh, the NATO situation. I even have a statement from Keir Starmer about that because obviously Europe is freaking out. We're gonna dash through Davos real quick. I have a lot of stuff. I just have a lot of things happening. We may not really get to them all, sort of thing. But yeah, we're gonna have some fun. So these all my tabs aren't quite arranged the way that they need to be, but we're gonna dive right in. Before I do all that, though, I want to remind you to subscribe to my newsletter, CameronJournal.com/subscribe or CameronJournal.substack.com. And also, if you'd like to support this journalism, please subscribe to the Cameron Journal Plus, which gets you into the private Discord, plus some other fun perks. And you can do that at CameronJournal.com/subscribe. Thank you to all my Cameron Journal Plus subscribers who do support the journalism. I appreciate that. I also social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, which is a fun place to follow. I post unique threads about different things, breakdowns of the podcast, all that type of thing. Facebook.com/Cameron L. Cowan. I'm also Cameron Cowan on LinkedIn, so you can follow me in all those locations. Before we get into the headlines, I have a personal note that I want to make. Today is Martin Luther King Day, as you might have seen. And I received word this morning that my father, Wardell McGee, passed and went home to the Lord, as we would say and he would say. This morning I received a call from family. He was 79. No, I take that back. 78, because his birthday wasn't until next month. 78, and he passed in Northport, Alabama, his home. And he'd been having health issues for a while, so it wasn't unanticipated. And although I was not there, I knew about it, and apparently he was ready to go, and he was ready for his health struggle to be over. Longtime listeners of the podcast will know I did not meet my father till I was 23 years old. And longtime listeners of the podcast will also know that he and I had a difficult and distant relationship for the past 14-ish, 15-ish years that we knew each other. But the last phone call we had, he was in a rehab facility and we were talking about everything. And the last phone call he had, he told me I love you about 5 times. And at the time, I thought it was a little bit corny. But as it turns out, it was the perfect final phone call for us to have. And so I'm going to be passing this a little bit along to family and everything. But I wanted to shout out my father. I mentioned it on Twitter this morning. Not that anyone would care. But he didn't always express his love in the conventional way, but he loved to follow me on social media. He reposted stuff from the show all the time. He liked stuff from the show all the time. One of the times I got in the argument about racism on Twitter, and I said, Jim Crow is a thing. There are people alive who lived through it. My father lived through it, and he's still here. And he actually commented and said, yep, still going, which was really great and reinforced my argument. So he loved interacting on social media. He loved basketball. He had a lot of interesting jobs. He was a snowplow driver for the city of Denver for years and years. He moved back down to Alabama in 2007. He had a brief part in a movie as a doorman at one point. He was a limousine driver for a while. He was a semi-professional baseball player for a lot of his adult life. And his moving up to Denver to kind of break out on his own was how he met my mom. They had a short relationship, but not all the results were bad. So, so I just wanted to give him a special shout out. It's been weighing on me a lot today, and it really shouldn't. We weren't that terribly close. Our relationship was brief in my 37 years of life and his 78 years of life. But I did enjoy some of the wonderful times I had in Alabama with the family. I went down there for Christmas one year. I went on a couple visits down there, and I was living in Seattle. It was a long flight. It was a lot closer now. And so I just wanted to shout that out to everybody and let everybody know that there's been a little death in my world. Death has been circling quite close lately. People who regularly watch know that I had a dear friend of mine pass last fall. And so it seems like every couple of months I'm doing a memorial for somebody. Oh, thank you, someone in the comments. Thank you very much. It seems that I spend a lot of time doing memorials now, which is really really difficult. But I wanted to shout that out because it's been on my mind all day today, and I have not hardly been able to focus. I think I'm still processing, but I also come from people for whom the best way to get through grief is to begin working. So let's do that and dive into the headlines. Let me do this. Let me change to video. And let me get rid of this overlay, which was from last week's Living Joke Show. And I did not change the overload. Or the overlays, rather. And we will begin right now. We'll dive into international news because we're gonna talk about Venezuela and Greenland. We'll just do that for an overlay. And let me get rid of those and get rid of those and move that over here, and here we go. Oh, hello. Thank you for commenting, person on Twitch that says, yo, what's up, fat guy? I am very fat. Thank you for observing. I'm doing well, thank you. Let's talk about Venezuela. So, in the midst of the crisis in Greenland and everything else, we're still in the middle of the Venezuela situation. And this post, Cory Booker was speaking out against this morning, and I thought this commentary was rather interesting. It says here, now they're including the Venezuela strikes in the narrative, and not just Greenland. This is a shift. The words illegal, he said it out loud in writing. This is a new milestone being reached. They're not saying abuse of power or possible corruption. He's making a legal accusation. Legal. The words he's using and how he's using them are exactly how prosecutors talk about these types of crimes. He's laying a mens rea, which means why it happened, groundwork for establishing a criminal state of mind. He's laid out intent, enrichment, and concealment. Doing this sets the predication for hearings, investigations if there's time, and yes, impeachment. This is a signal, in my opinion, that they've fleshed out the violations of the law and had them legally reviewed. Language like this invites defamation unless it's true. The post definitely went through legal scrutiny. He's no longer saying if true or reports suggest. I know it's excruciatingly slow for us, but in congressional terms, they're barreling towards impeachment as a ready option. And here's the reason why we're talking about this. There has been, especially today on Twitter and even Instagram, a lot of people calling for the impeachment of President Trump, who, you may remember, holds the record for most impeachments. 50% of impeachments in U.S. history have been against Donald Trump. I don't think this dog hunts, and I'll tell you why. I don't think anybody is in the mood to go through what happened in the first term. That's not where the country's at. That's not where that is at. And the post from Cory Booker is here in short, and he says, after illegally and unconstitutionally striking Venezuela, Trump is now selling Venezuelan oil through a campaign donor and funneling the proceeds to an offshore account in Qatar, creating a potential slush fund with no accountability, oversight, or guardrails for Trump and his allies. His continued abuse of power doesn't serve the Venezuelan people or the American people, and certainly doesn't lower costs for Americans. This outrage is yet another example of his unchecked corruption as he again ignores laws and enriches his friends, donors, and himself. The part about this I definitely agree with is it is a narrative shift. I don't think it has much veracity beyond that. And I'll say, because no one's in the mood for it. And honestly, Democrats would have to knock it out of the park for the midterms in November. Supposing we even have elections, we're going to come back to that. Would have to knock it out of the park in November to get enough seats to even have a hope of being successful. And given that you need 60 votes in the Senate, and if everything goes right, they'll get a 4-seat majority, they'll still need 6 Republicans to convict and remove. However, I think the focus needs to be less on impeachment and much more on Congress actually taking the time to restrict the power of the president. That would be a far, far better option. I'm not any happier about the strike in Venezuela than everyone else, although I am happy that Maduro was gone. I'm just not happy with the way it happened. But no one's happy. No one's sad to see the back of Nicolas Maduro. Let's be clear about that. And the people saying that, oh, well, we should... No. The world's a better place for being rid of Nicolas Maduro, but the way in which it was done is not great. Congress should work on that, not on impeachment. However, I think this is a very interesting... I do agree with this person. I think it is a very interesting narrative shift, and I think there's definitely a certain case being made, but I don't think it leads to impeachment. Moving right along, so this post is rather interesting because it gets into alliance systems. And before we do that, I want to... Let's listen to Keir Starmer talk about Greenland before we dive into that post.
It's a close ally of the United Kingdom and of the United States, a proud NATO member that has stood shoulder to shoulder with us, including at real human cost in recent decades. Alliances endure because they're built on respect and partnership, not pressure. That is why I said the use of tariffs against allies is completely wrong. It is not the right way to resolve differences within an alliance. Nor is it helpful to frame efforts to strengthen Greenland's security as a justification for economic pressure. Such measures hurt British workers, British businesses, and the British economy. And that is why I've been so clear on this. Is a close ally of the United Kingdom.
It's kind of cut off at the beginning, but he's talking about Denmark. So the reason why I picked this out is because it was quite, with everything going on between the transatlantic partnership and Greenland, we've had multiple statements. This one is from Keir Starmer, and I wanted to start with that first because this post is a bit disingenuous, and it's really the first part. It says here, nobody can tell me what a, quote, alliance, unquote, actually is. I've literally seen supposedly in touch and educated Europeans say things like if NATO collapses, Europe will rearm and manage its own defense within 10 years. If you need 10 years to rearm, you aren't in a defense alliance, you are a free rider outsourcing your defense requirements. I've seen criticism for Europeans that if only the US was determined, we could have kicked Russia out of Ukraine, as Europe only recently started providing any military support and still expects the US to handle everything. That's not an alliance, that's a free riding problem. Until anyone can seriously answer number 1, what are shared threats we agree upon, and 2, how we will burden share responsibilities equitably, there's no alliance, it is a free rider and service provider. Okay. The rest of it is not important. This is what's important. So remember, Keir Starmer just said, not using terrorists against alliance and partners, alliances are built in trust, all this type of thing. There's a very specific reason we have disincentivized Europe from rearming. Let's open the history book together. In the 20th century, before 1950, Europe managed to have 2 world wars that killed 100 million people on almost every inhabited continent on this planet. And after 1945, some very smart people said, maybe we should take the guns away from the people conducting all the wars. Not just the Germans, everyone. And so, Europe did not necessarily rearm a whole lot after World War II. Now, admittedly, early in the Cold War, Europe was more armed. Some countries, like the UK, like France, mostly because they had overseas colonial possessions, needed to retain certain capabilities, and their economies were large enough to do so. Germany was disincentivized just from rearming. Most of Eastern Europe was under Soviet control by about 1952. And in Western Europe, you had a handful of countries who could basically hold off the Soviets long enough for America to arrive. Especially during the Cold War, there was a fear that without Western Europe being able to ably defend itself in an emergency, waiting for the US to more fully arrive with more assets, that was sort of good enough. At the end of the Cold War in 1991, there was mass disarmament around the world. The United States and Russia reduced arms as part of treaties, especially nuclear weapons, around which a lot of those treaties have now expired. But at the time, we had a handful of nuclear non-proliferation treaties, and that had required a certain amount of disarmament. Europe, especially Western Europe, reduced spending on arms following the Cold War. And that has left some countries like Spain, post-Franco Spain, Portugal, Italy, Germany, South Central Europe without a lot of military spending. Eastern Europe hadn't had military spending because most of them were part of the Warsaw Pact or part of the USSR, and there were a variety of security agreements. Some countries, looking at you, Romania, overspent on the military, like the rest of the Soviet Union. Other parts were under more direct control and did not at all, like Ukraine. In the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of this was negotiated. The reason Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons was part of a security guarantee by Russia and the United States, which obviously Russia violated in 2022. So, the reason why NATO exists was to originally counter the Soviet threat. The second reason it existed was to help aid in common and mutual defense across all allies. Just because Europe doesn't have a lot of high troop counts or a lot of high plane counts or doesn't spend a lot on GDP doesn't mean they're not helping. That being said, Europe has been a bit of a free rider because successive presidential administrations have tried to get Europe to meet the 5% GDP minimum target for spending on defense. Because the US, because the U.S. has always had a large military budget and our military-industrial complex likes to get paid, we obviously have always had this sort of outsized, military budget because until very recently, we wanted to be able to deploy forces anywhere on the planet at any time within 72 hours. We invaded Afghanistan in 3 weeks. That was the attitude of the time. In a post-Cold War environment, there was not until very recently a huge reason for Europe to rearm. That does not necessarily mean an alliance is weaker. There are other NATO countries with capable militaries. There are other NATO countries that could serve as that stopgap. In the event of some sort of Russian action. I think the implication that an alliance only works when everyone is pulling their fair weight isn't necessarily incorrect, but it's not by accident. Some of the security protocols were quite intentional. And one of the intentions was to prevent another land war in Europe. Because again, we'd done such a good job with the first 2. That was part of the problem. Now, geopolitics have changed a lot. during the globalization era, which I think we can say is over, there was even less incentive because the U.S. was patrolling the oceans. So were the British, so were the French, but the U.S. only was patrolling the oceans. Trade was open, and there was this idea that the world's problems could be solved through trade, through negotiation, through diplomacy. This was an area where Europe, especially via the EU, once the EU became its own organization, excelled at a great deal, and then also denies the fact that we are the one of the few we're the only nation who's used the Article 5 defense protocol of NATO to ask all NATO countries to contribute to our war in Afghanistan. Everybody was there. The Germans, the Danes, the French, the British, all this sort of thing. Britain lost tens of thousands of soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan fighting alongside us. Same for Canada, same for a lot of other partners. Just because they're not spending $1 trillion a year on the military doesn't mean they're layabouts and louses. Also, these countries have oftentimes opened their lands to military bases with all the associated problems. Ask Japan about Okinawa, with the associated difficulties with that, so that we could project power globally. Our ability to protect countries has been a huge diplomatic chip. It has been the paperweight that has ensured world peace for 80 years. As one posted today, if you thought paying for the liberal world order was expensive, wait till you pay for what's next. An alliance is a deterrent. An alliance is an agreement. An alliance does not necessarily mean checking the accounts to see who spent what. Sometimes it is, but that's not necessarily the be-all end-all of what an alliance means. And that is an important thing to remember, and that's there's a lot of misunderstanding, I think bad information about how these things really work, and that is perfectly demonstrated by this post and how different things are happening in geopolitics. And that's extremely prescient, especially given this video, which is Emmanuel Macron talking about a major intelligence leak between the United States, Ukraine, and Russia. So I love the Krasenstein brothers. It says here, a French media report says Ukrainian intelligence stopped sharing high-value intelligence with the U.S. after concluding American leaks were reaching Moscow, citing a severe breakdown of trust during the Trump administration. The claim is attributed to senior Ukrainian intelligence leaders. Between this and the Greenland mess, can we just impeach Trump already? See what I mean? Everyone's got that on the brain. Not a thing. Anyway, I don't know if this is in English or not. If not, I will translate.
Où l'Ukraine était éminemment dépendante des capacités de renseignement américaines, à une écrasante majorité, il y a un an. Aujourd'hui, les 2/3 sont fournis par la France. Les 2/3.
Alors cette déclaration, elle est passée un petit peu inaperçue.
Okay, he's talking about going to the U.S. to negotiate about Ukraine. That's not necessarily hugely important. They're going to get into the intelligence thing right now, but it's in French. We won't watch the whole thing. Krasenstein had the most important part. He was talking about his upcoming trip to the United States to negotiate about Ukraine, which is fine. So there's so much else going on today. This should be a much bigger story than it is. Basically, what had happened, I had read in other reports, is that the French and the Ukrainians decided to see how much intelligence, or if intelligence, about Ukraine was reaching Moscow. They fed fake information through to the Trump administration, found out about it on the other side, and concluded that yes, that was definitely happening. And this was all exposed in this report, and that's how we that's a troubling thing. But the result of this, and I don't think I have any stories in here about this, but the result has been a lot of new people bringing up Trump's ties to Russia and the Russia hoax that was never really a hoax, but that's a whole other conversation. Anyway, the whole Trump is a Russian intelligence asset has gotten brought up again in a big way. People are reposting articles, people are pointing at it again, all this type of thing. I don't necessarily know if that does or does not apply to Trump specifically. There's evidence for, there's evidence against. The only people who know that for sure work in Moscow. However, this is troubling simply because if Ukraine cannot trust their biggest ally who's applying material support, then Ukraine is in very deep trouble. Also, the fact that they're not providing us with high level intelligence anymore makes it a lot harder for our assets on the ground, and yes, we do have assets on the ground in Ukraine. It's a lot harder for them to become a part of the fight and operate effectively either. Minus the fact this is a betrayal. Now, when we think about those thoughts about trust, those thoughts about being able to trust alliance partners, all this type of thing. If you can't trust your friend, do you want to hang out with your friend? If the United States becomes untrustworthy, which it's hard to think of it any other way after today, it will have devastating geopolitical consequences. If there is a big pullback, even the EU even threatened to stop trading with the United States over, if tariffs are implemented over Greenland. Europe is our second biggest trading partner after Mexico. And for those of you wondering what do we get important from Europe, insulin. 74% of insulin is manufactured in Denmark specifically. It would take us a year and a half to replace that production capacity. Millions would die in insulin shortages, including children. So, just things to bear in mind as the trust with our alliance partners begins to break down ever so slowly, and it appears that the White House, or at least the Trump administration, somebody, is leaked to Moscow for high-level Ukraine intelligence. One of the big stories today, this is the New York Times live update, is about the text message that Trump said to the president of Norway. And it says here that President Trump is now claiming that one reason he's pushing to acquire Greenland is that he didn't win the Nobel Prize. And that might sound odd, but it would sound, weird, except it's real. According to a text message he sent to Norway's Prime Minister over the weekend, Jonas Gahr Støre, Norway's leader, received the text message on Sunday, an official in the Prime Minister's office said on Monday. Quote, "Considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace, although it will always be predominant, but now can think about what is good and proper for the United States of America," Mr. Trump wrote in the message, which was first published by PBS. Mr. Trump also questioned Denmark's claim to Greenland, saying, quote, "There are no written documents," and adding, "The world is not secure unless we have complete and total control of Greenland. Thank you." The tensions over Greenland have sharply escalated in the last week, and the message injected a new level of uncertainty into Mr. Trump's thinking in his campaign to gain control of the island. Greenland has been a part of the Danish kingdom for more than 300 years, and world leaders have condemned Mr. Trump's insistence that the United States take over the territory, a giant icebound island in the Arctic region. According to copies of the messages provided by the Norwegian Prime Minister's office, Mr. Trump's message was in a response to one that Mr. Støre sent to Trump on Sunday. It was co-signed by the President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, a leader with whom Mr. Trump is close. The European leaders asked to speak to Mr. Trump about Greenland and his threat of using tariffs to pressure Denmark into selling it, which Denmark has refused to do. They asked for a phone call and struck a collaborative tone, writing, "We believe we should all work to take this down and de-escalate. So much is happening around us where we need to stand together." After Mr. Trump's response, Mr. Støre said in a statement, quote, "As regards the Nobel Peace Prize, I have on several occasions clearly explained to Trump what is well known, namely that it is an independent Nobel committee, not the Norwegian government, that awards the prize," Mr. Støre said. The White House did not respond to requests for comment. Mr. Trump has repeatedly challenged Denmark's claims to Greenland, but in decades-old agreements that the United States has signed with Denmark, the United States has recognized Denmark's close connection to the island. A 2004 amendment to an older defense pact between Denmark and the United States, which grants the United States broad military access, explicitly recognizes Greenland as an equal part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And in 1916, Denmark sold what are now the U.S. Virgin Islands to the United States for $25 million in gold. In the treaty for that deal, a clause reads, quote, "The United States of America will not object to the Danish government extending their political and economic interest to the whole of Greenland." In the past year, Mr. Trump has repeatedly vowed to get Greenland. Denmark has repeatedly rebuffed him. Denmark's position is that it does not have the authority to sell the self-governing territory, and that Greenland's 57,000 inhabitants will decide their own fate. Polls and interviews show that an overwhelming majority of Greenlanders strongly oppose joining the United States. On Saturday, Greenlanders staged the biggest protest of recent months. Hundreds marched through the snowy streets of Nuuk, the capital chanting, "No means no, Greenland is already great, and Yankee go home." In the past few days, Denmark and other European countries have sent more military forces to the island. Small groups of Danish soldiers dressed in green camouflage and dark woolen hats have been walking through downtown Nuuk. Beyond the harbor, a 200-foot-long Danish warship capable of breaking through ice has been patrolling the shoreline. A much-anticipated three-way meeting last week of the United States, Denmark, and Greenland, hosted by Vice President J.D. Vance in Washington, did not produce any breakthroughs and seemed instead to create misunderstandings. It was the first time Greenland had been included in such high-level discussions, and the Danish and Greenlandic officials left saying that a working group had been formed to explore possibilities for a solution. But the Trump administration said afterwards that the two sides would begin technical talks on the acquisition of Greenland, a statement that raised even more concern in Greenland, in Denmark, and across Europe. So what we're saying is Trump is mad that he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, even though the person who did win it actually gave it to him. That happened last week. And therefore, ergo, Greenland is his next big thing. Here's the funny part. Trump may not know that Denmark and Norway are separate countries. He just kind of thinks of them as all of one amorphous blob sort of thing. Which is rather interesting and entertaining. Again, it would sound weird, except for the fact that it's real and it happened and we have it from the Norwegians, and this is just, this whole thing today has just blown so wide open. It's not even funny. It's I think the problem for Trump is it's personal. And ironically, his own book, The Art of the Deal, expressly says not to do that, which I think is funny. He's kind of breaking his own rule book on how to do deals. You can't let them be personal, and he's making it personal. I think it's also kind of frightening when he says, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace. I'm not going to ask what that means, because, the answer's obvious and the answer's rhetorical. But I kind of wonder where his head is at with all of that. But I mean, that is the latest with the Greenland situation. I mean, that's kind of where it stands today. And there is, given all the military stuff that we have in Greenland, there's really no need for us to own it. I think Trump is doing this to own Europe. And not own as in buy it, I mean own in internet speak. Just to kind of, pwn Europe. To be kind of like, well, you didn't give me the medal I wanted, so now I'm going to just seize some territory and, go that route. Which is kind of frightening. It strikes me as a little bit of a temper tantrum, but it is blowing the whole situation wide open. There is a lot of threats from Europe coming out on economic sanctions, ceasing trade, tariffs, all this type of thing. Trump is doing the same. And given that Danish troops are in Greenland and Trump is preparing the 11th Airborne in Alaska, literally we could end up with a shooting war with a NATO ally, and that could be the collapse of NATO. Let's think for a moment, who benefits from the collapse of NATO? Who? Who would benefit from the collapse of NATO? Ugh. Oh, wait. I know. Russia benefits greatly from a collapse of NATO. Do with that information what you will. It is 7:41 and we have a lot of tabs, so we're going to skip some things. We're going to skip the Midas Touch video. We're going to skip that one. Let me see if I have anything else on Greenland in here. I do have some stuff on Minnesota. We can go to Minnesota for a minute. Don't need that. That's Minnesota. We can talk about that. Oh, this is actually this. We should watch this. So there's not often I agree with JD Vance. Although I liked him better when he wasn't a fan of Trump. But this is good. This is good. This is the he articulates very clearly what the right-wing issue with globalization is, what a lot of us have been saying about globalization, although I was attacking globalization from the left, what a lot of people have been saying about globalization since the WTO protests with China joining the World Trade Organization in 1989 in Seattle. We may not like whose mouth it's coming from, but it sounds damn good. Listen up.
Because there were two conceits that our leadership class had when it came to globalization. The first is assuming that we can separate the making of things from the design of things. The idea of globalization was that rich countries would move further up the value chain while the poor countries made the simpler things. You would open an iPhone box and it would say designed in Cupertino, California. Now the implication, of course, is that it would be manufactured in Shenzhen or somewhere else. And yeah, some people might lose their jobs in manufacturing, but they could learn to design, or to use a very popular phrase, learn to code. But I think we got it wrong. It turns out that the geographies that do the manufacturing get awfully good at the designing of things. There are network effects, as you all well understand. The firms that design products work with firms that manufacture. They share intellectual property, they share best practices, and they even sometimes share critical employees. Now, we assume that other nations would always trail us in the value chain, but it turns out that as they got better at the low end of the value chain, they also started catching up on the higher end. We were squeezed from both ends. Now, that was the first conceit of globalization. I think the second is that cheap labor is fundamentally a crutch, and it's a crutch that inhibits innovation. I might even say that it's a drug that too many American firms got addicted to. Now, if you can make a product more cheaply, it's far too easy to do that rather than to innovate. And whether we were offshoring factories to cheap labor economies or importing cheap labor through our immigration system, cheap labor became the drug of Western economies. And I'd say that if you look in nearly every country from Canada to the UK that imported large amounts of cheap labor, you've seen productivity stagnate. I don't think that's not a total happenstance. I think that the connection is very direct. Now, one of the debates you hear on the minimum wage, for instance, is that increases in the minimum wage force firms to automate. So a higher wage at McDonald's means more kiosks. And whatever your views on the wisdom of the minimum wage, I'm not going to comment on that here. Companies innovating in the absence of cheap labor is a good thing. I think most of you are not worried about getting cheaper and cheaper labor. You're worried about innovating, about building new things, about the old formulation of technology is doing more with less. You guys are all trying to do more with less every single day. And so I'd ask my friends, both on the tech optimist side and on the populist side, not to see the failure of the logic of globalization as a failure of innovation. Indeed, I'd say that globalization's hunger for cheap labor is a problem precisely because it's been bad for innovation. Both our working people, our populists, and our innovators gathered here today have the same enemy. And the solution, I believe, is American innovation. Because
honestly, 1010 no notes. He's not wrong. I have been saying on this show every night for 3 years, until you get American corporations off the teat of cheap labor, you will never solve immigration. Simple as. It is literally that simple. That's it. And he's absolutely right. The whole he's talking about is what's called the head and body theory of economies. The idea was that poorer countries would make stuff, smarter countries would design it and do all the intellectual, engineering, all this type of thing. And he's absolutely right. What especially China has done is they've taken that ability, those skills, that talented workforce, and they have gotten better and better and better to where now they are doing things on par with the United States. There was a group of auto executives that went over to China to look at BYD's facilities, and they were blown away. Like, the CEO of Ford said, we are behind. We are so behind what the Chinese are doing. And there's a lot of, when you're making stuff regularly, there's a lot of opportunity for innovation. Instantly, that's something where American industry has always struggled. One of the reasons Japan was able to rise in the 70s and 80s was, ironically, because of steel. After the war, Japan did not have very many steel mills, and so when they built new steel mills, they built them with the most modern technology of the time. That often includes what was called electric arc furnaces. They're cheaper, they're faster, they're more efficient, all this type of thing. So Japanese steel was much, much cheaper than American steel, which still used old-fashioned blast furnaces, which by the early 1970s was a dated technology. A lot of steel firms never installed new furnaces, didn't want to spend the capital, would rather return it to shareholders, and that was the American steel industry gone under. Incidentally, the Nippon Steel deal, which Trump almost killed and eventually did go through with U.S. Steel, part of Nippon's plan was to finally put in new electric arc furnaces in U.S. Steel because they're just simply faster and more efficient. And steel is an excellent example. That's a real life example of how that happens. Japan did it. China did it. We have been, dealing with these onslaughts from both sides for all of these years. And what it has left behind is a populace that doesn't have jobs, that has decreased spending power. It's very hard to find jobs that pay a living wage, all this sort of thing. Your TV's never been cheaper. But that's how we've gotten ourselves into the present situation and the present circumstances. When I saw this video, I was dead shocked that it was J.D. Vance talking about it, although he had talked about that in his book, so I suppose it's not too surprising, but I was still shocked I had forgotten. And it's like, yeah, I could have said this. I have been saying this for years and years. Like, yes, and offshoring, all this sort of thing, there are so many towns, especially in this region. I'm currently in Connecticut, especially in this region of the country. There's a whole legacy of industry here that's rotting and decaying. There are massive facilities that are rotting and decaying because those jobs left 30 years ago to Thailand, to Vietnam, to Malaysia, to Indonesia, to China, to Japan, all these sorts of things. And that has hollowed out the American workforce. And there are many towns that would be thriving and growing if they still had a major industrial employer there who's was innovating and coming up with new products and new processes and new automation. Reindustrialization really is a revitalization of America, and that will only work if it is focused on people and workers and getting money in the pockets of people. And J.D. Vance is right. You cannot have a successful society that's relying on cheap labor, at least not for very long anyway. I think one of the things he kind of forgets is part of the reason the conceits of globalization were put into place was because of what was happening with inflation in the late 70s due to us leaving the gold standard in 1971, and we had really overspent in the 60s. So in the 60s, we decided to do a lot of things at once. One of them is we created the modern welfare state. The other one was we went to the moon. The Apollo program was costing 10% of GDP at its closure in 72. It was very expensive to do that. And so coming out of the 60s, we'd spent all of this money. And the reality is we had spent more than we had gold. And so Nixon decided to solve this problem by ending the Bretton Woods system, which had set the price of gold fixed at $35 per 1 ounce of gold, and he left the gold standards and let the currency free float. The result was inflation. Now, this was also abetted by the oil crises of 73, 74, and 75 with OPEC and all this type of thing, that a sudden increase in the cost of energy also fueled the inflation. But the way Volcker got inflation to come down was by raising interest rates absolutely sky high and by basically divorcing wages from productivity. And basically what they did is they filled it in with two things. They filled it in with cheaper goods made overseas, and they filled it in with consumer debt. Both of things that were innovations of the mid to late 80s. Didn't have credit scores before 89. didn't really have credit cards till the mid-'80s, all this sort of thing. That was how they papered over the fact that workers were not keeping up with, workers' wages could not keep up with productivity and break the cycle of inflation. And globalization allowed us to get away with that. Globalization's now falling apart. What comes next? I don't know, but JD Vance is right. If we want to fix this society, we have got to get off of cheap labor. People have got to get paid a decent wage again. We cannot continue with shareholder capitalism. We cannot continue stuffing the pockets of the asset wealthy and expect people to continue. Can't do it. Otherwise, we will end up with collapse. So he's absolutely 110% right, and it's fair to say so. And anyone who gets in my comments and complains about me complimenting JD Vance can suck it. This is the post about Iran. But before we go to the post about Iran, someone asked a question in the comment section. Aren't the IRGC killing protesters in Iran right now? They are. Reports have come in of at least 20,000, possibly more, people killed by the Iranian regime. The number is probably higher. There's an internet blackout right now, and there's a huge crackdown. Rumor running around is that the crackdown is working, but we don't necessarily know for how long. I want to dive in to this piece. It's full on Substack, but we're going to kind of go to the end. Where it says, well, we'll skip over a little bit. So it says here, there's an enormous amount of misinformation circulating about the current Iranian revolution. Almost all of it stems from historical revisionism and distortion deliberately spread since at least the 1970s by the Islamic regime and its ideological allies, most prominently the Islamist Marxist terrorist cult MEK. Two core mantras have been relentlessly repeated by Islamist and Marxist camps and successfully entrenched over decades. The first is the claim that the Shah was a murderous dictator and a footman of the CIA. Now, just know that's the informational bit. Coming down here to the bottom, this context matters because it stands in stark contrast to the mythology constructed around the Shah. Pahlavi is portrayed as a bloodthirsty dictator, yet even his critics speak of only a few thousand deaths, including executions nearly over 4 decades. The majority were linked to Marxist terrorism or Islamic insurgency. The highest estimates, around 3,000, span an entire era and describe a security state confronting political violence and terrorism, not the systemic killing of civilians. Now contrast this with the Islamic Republic or any other regime in the region, including NATO member Turkey and Erdogan's mass killing of Kurds. According to Iran International and Iranian human rights networks, there's a clear pattern. In 78 to 81, 88, and 19, 20, and 23, and the most recent wave, tens of thousands have been killed in extremely short time frames during crackdowns. Reports of 20,000 killed within weeks point to meticulously organized and executed genocidal waves carried out by the IRGC and proxy Arab militias. The barbarity of these operations includes street executions, rape, systemic maiming, the deliberate blinding of protesters, and the burning alive of defenseless civilians. As always, under closed terror systems, precise numbers remain unclear. However, the scale exceeds anything comparable to the Pahlavi area. Pahlavi's monarchy was a modernization project with very limited authoritarianism, constrained by institutions and guided by a forward-looking civilizational model that neither rested on a morbid ideology nor sacralized killing and industrialized terror. Curiously, Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah are portrayed as authoritarian dictators, despite being comparatively liberal next to Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who ruled ruthlessly, crushed all opposition, and is still revered as a national hero. The key difference here is timing. Ataturk emerged as a nationalist revolutionary on the ruins of the Islamic Ottoman Empire, which allowed him to take over Turkey. And it was kind of interesting because the Shah was not always popular. He was a bit decadent. This is a man that had his lunch flown in via Concorde for a while. Late in the, from Paris, so he could have, Parisian lunch sort of thing. Horrific waste. And I was mindful of reading this because last week we had on Zalal Habibi, and I had asked her if there was any way the Shah, this guy, Reza Pahlavi, he has died, but his son is the crown prince, is still alive, and he has been, actively encouraging people to protest and to lead on all of this. And I said, well, perhaps his son, who would be Shah if they were still in power, could, aid with the transition of the Iranian government. He could partner with the diaspora, and, much like the monarchy helped transition out of Francoist Spain into a new modern era, perhaps the Shah could help Iran do that too. And she said, no, 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 no. The Shah was terrible. There was all these killings. He had the secret police, the Savak, all this sort of thing. And so I found it, and it was lovely and interesting and fascinating. And I was kind of just like, oh, it could be a thing. Nope, not popular. Okay, great. And this is kind of interesting to kind of stand in contrast to that idea that, the Shah wasn't necessarily so bad, and that, perhaps bringing back the monarchy to Iran is a better idea than the current theocracy. I think anything would be better than the current theocracy, but it appears that a lot of at least the diaspora resistance groups, like the one we spoke to, are looking for just a more modern democracy than maybe a constitutional monarchy with a history of a leader, hereditary leader that had been violent against the Iranian people. Although I did see video today of protests of people asking for the Shah to return. So it'll be interesting to see what role the Shah plays in Iran and what role Reza Pahlavi plays. And he posted himself earlier today. He is planning to return to Iran to help Iran into this new era. It'll be interesting to see how these resistance groups that have been around for 40, 50 years and the Shah clash together in creating the new institutions and the new government of Iran once the present government is unseated. And I don't know if they're going to survive this. They have survived stuff before, but this one I think is particularly bad. And I think it's a very hard time right now if you are in the present Iranian government. This is a long article in The Atlantic about the America and the world and the changing world order. Might have to say that for the newsletter. This is about Davos, which is not important, all this type of thing. That's a post about the thing we just talked about with Norway. This is more to do with Minnesota, and we should check in on Minnesota quickly. This is really important, and I might save it for next week because it's evergreen. Let us check in on Minnesota though. So, this clip from Fox Business is Representative Andy Ogles talking about Minnesota and the present protests and the pushback against ICE action in Minnesota, and it is it's rather caustic. So let's listen in.
So look, when you look at the footage of those folks that stormed that church, if that was a bunch of conservatives, a bunch of MAGA folks, they all been arrested, right? But because they're libtards in a blue city, they get a pass. Enough is enough. You have, when you look at ICE, when you look at the difficult job they're doing, more importantly, you look at the individuals they're detaining. So when you look at the criminal records of those that they're detaining, both from their home country and here, roughly 70% have some sort of criminal record. This is who's being deported: murderers, rapists, drug traffickers, child traffickers. We need to get rid of those folks, get them out of our society. And if the libtards are going to side with lawlessness, that's on them, not on the rest of us. Because you know what? This is an 80-20 issue. America wants a better economy, safe streets, and part of that is President Trump's deportation orders.
Yeah.
So look, when you look at the footage.
That's certainly a position. The position is not exciting. I think it is. I mean, and he's not necessarily wrong about the people protesting in a church because the pastor was connected to ICE. That was a thing this weekend. There were protesters who attacked a church during services because the pastor there has been working with ICE. Don Lemon was there. I saw a tweet that said that he might be getting charged, catching federal charges for being a part of that under the KKK Act. And he's not wrong. If MAGA people were marching into a church in protest, it probably would not have gone down that way. However, I think it is it is unbecoming of a sitting congressperson to use a word like libtard on television. I think it is entertaining the casual way with which he just lets that fly and Fox doesn't push back on it. It's also an indication that he doesn't necessarily see the other side as people. Now, one could definitely argue there's plenty of liberals who think the same thing about MAGA people. That road travels both ways, and it's very wide, well painted, and plowed. This is so emblematic of what's wrong with political dialogue today, though. I mean, the situation in Minnesota is quite perilous given the present giant corruption scandal involving the Somali community, and given, you know, what's happening with ICE and the protests and the shooting of Renee Good and how that has become a thing of the moment and all this type of thing. It is quite obvious we're not seeing each other as fellow citizens. We're not seeing each other as people participating in society. We're seeing each other as MAGA Nazis and libtards. And that's it. That's the sides, whatever have you. And I guess I don't expect a backbench congressman from Tennessee to be mindful of all of these things, but it is a rather, you know, stark and sad moment, I think, for the country. I heard a comment. Oh, someone says the priest had the same name. He was unrelated to ICE. Well, see, that's even more dumb because then that whole protest was pointless. I had seen only a couple videos about it. The one with Don Lemon talking to somebody, and there was another several tweets this morning about it. No. See, that's even more dumb. And regardless of whether he was, thank you though. Regardless of whether he was laid to ICE, those protesters shouldn't have been there. Not at church, not during that whole idea was so dumb. Mostly because, and here's the important part, the right to protest ends at the sidewalk because the church is private property owned by the church. So if you want to protest the church, you have to be outside on the street and the sidewalk. Now out there, you may put up as many signs as you wish. You may stand there all the live long day at 20 degrees in the snow. That's all fine for you. But that they should never have gone inside. They should have never interrupted services, all this type of thing. Regardless of all of this, the political dialogue on all of this is absolutely gone to hell in a handbasket. And the fact that they didn't even get the right place to protest is even worse. So, terrible. Let's see. Oh, yes. Here was the story about the 11th Airborne Division being on standby. This is Soldier of Fortune magazine. On standby for possible deployment to Minnesota. Although I don't think that's necessarily the case. This person says that Minnesota would be a good place to stage these forces in the lower 48 to prep them for Greenland. People are convinced that they're sending in the 11th Airborne Division into Minnesota because there's now a potential conflict between ICE and the Minnesota National Guard, which Tim Walz has called up to restore order. So you're going to see this because it's been all over social media, not just Twitter, but elsewhere. You're going to see this. We have no proof that the 11th Airborne is going to Minnesota, so just slow that roll. They're probably preparing to go to Greenland, which is a whole other problem and a whole other matter. So, but you're going to see, from a narrative perspective, you're going to see stuff like this. And this is where it's so kind of confusing right now because this was the original post about the Nobel Prize. There was, just there's so much going on right now. It's so crazy. This post was very emblematic. It says the president is occupying a major city with armed paramilitaries. Is blackmailing treaty allies to hand over their sovereign territory. Fair. Is trying to set himself as the chairman for life of a UN rival with $1 billion fees for permanent membership. That's his peace council. And is talking about canceling elections, which Trump talks about casually all the time and can't be taken seriously till he does something. There's so much going on right now, but particularly the situation in Minnesota is so difficult because you have, this immigration situation, you have this massive corruption scandal, you now have people getting shot, and here's the problem with violence. Once violence starts, it's easy for it to escalate. Like, it's very easy for violence to beget more violence both ways. You see this with insurgency groups, you see this with things all the time. Violence is very good at making more violence. And my worry is that as we have more people protesting, more people trying to stop ICE, and not even at the right address, then there's going to be more opportunities for more conflict to occur. And as more conflict occurs and it gets, even worse, it gets more and more dangerous, and the chances for a larger and more protracted conflict get even worse. And for historical reference, you can see things like Kent State. There are other, instances where that has happened, and you've ended up with Kent State wasn't a huge loss of life. It was more psychological. Only 3 people died, but violence does beget more violence, and that is its own danger and its own thing. Oh yes, that's Trump Russia thing. I'll talk about the newsletter. Oh yes, with the not wanting to do elections, the preservation of our nation is more important than elections. Prepare to see a lot more talking points like this rolling out next. You don't preserve a nation by discarding elections, you dismantle it. Narratively speaking, yes, you could hear this a lot more. And that is something we should all be very, very concerned about. But it is, oh, now this was good. We're going to save that for next week. And we're going to save that for the newsletter. But this is good. This is from David Sirota. Things are bad right now, but some perspective helps. Not too long ago, leaders of both parties forcibly sent American teenagers to die in Southeast Asia, and then they had lied the country into another war that cost $1 trillion and killed 1 million people, all while the economy was being rigged for bankers and billionaires to loot everything. Maybe the past politicians seem to you like nicer dudes than the current White House occupant, but things have been going in the wrong direction for a very long time, and even if you weren't paying as much attention because everyone had been a little bit more polite. The fact is, much of what we're living through now is less an anomaly and more a horrible culmination. I said, fuck yeah, David Sirota, when I read this morning. And that kind of loops back to the J.D. Vance video, actually. Like, this isn't the end. I don't know why I don't follow David Sirota. He's from Denver even. It loops back to the J.D. Vance video. We're at the end of that. All that stuff I said about the gold standard and Nixon and inflation, blah, blah. This is the end, and this summarizes it so damn well. We didn't get here overnight. We did not get here overnight. And even given the things that are happening in Minnesota, the things that are happening in Iran, Greenland, ICE, the protests last year in LA, all this type of thing, this did not happen overnight. We didn't get here overnight. And it's 10 after the hour, I gotta go. But we did not get here overnight. And we will pick up next week with more stories in the newsletter. But I'm going to close on this one. It's from Insider Wire, and it says the FBI asks agents nationwide to deploy temporarily to Minneapolis, and this is one of the people trying to say that the 11th Airborne is going to Minnesota, and it says, let me set the scene: 40+ JAG lawyers, elite cold weather paratroopers from the Army, 3,000 lawless Gestapo on the ground. They're talking about ICE. And hundreds of FBI agents. Trump is setting up and testing out a coup on the state level, likely under the guise of federal fraud and rebellion. Minnesota is the test case for a total takeover by a dictatorial regime nationwide. Let that sink in. I don't think we're there yet. I'll say it. I don't think the 11th Airborne is going to Minnesota. I wouldn't necessarily refer to ICE as lawless Gestapo. I think FBI agents going up there has probably a lot less to do with patrolling the streets and a lot more to do with forensic accounting. which it appears that they need. I think that, you know, is more into all of that. The 40 plus JAG lawyers, I'm not quite sure what that's for or about. But you don't send in the lawyers unless you're planning on having legal issues. I don't necessarily know that's what's going on in Minnesota or in Minneapolis. I think I think there is a frustration in the country, especially with the corruption scandal, that there's a lot of waste going on, a lot of money going on. It's the narrative that blue cities and blue states are corrupt, ran by corrupt Democrats, and here's the reality. It's going to be very, very hard electorally to convince people to let Democrats be in charge when you have things like Minnesota happening. And New York and California are next. Trump has already said so. Hell, the bottom scroll in the one video about the guy saying libtards literally said they're already training Antifa people in New York City to resist ICE and all this sort of thing. This whole situation is getting out of control in more ways than one. Unfortunately, I don't think anyone has any restraint on either side. Antifa, different leftist groups and all this type of thing will be absolutely as crazy. And what happens with these sorts of things, with, you know, an insurgency versus a regime, is you get these sort of leveling up of violence. You even see it in Iran. The more the regime cracks down, the larger the protests and the more violent they get. We're kind of going through the same thing. You know, the more sophisticated the protesters get, the more the federal government will come down. The more sophisticated the protesters get, the more the federal government will come down. It ends up just being a cycle that gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I was even telling someone this afternoon, I said it's probably not going to be men in uniforms shooting at each other. It's going to be more like the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Bus explosions, you know, with tacks and nails that kill and maim people terribly and horribly. That's a very hard thing to stop once it gets started. And that could be what we're really facing. And on that terrible note, I'm going to save these other stories for next week because they are interesting. Although not that one because that one's important for today, but we're not going to watch it right now. It's like a half hour. We're going to save all that for next week. And I am going to let you all go. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal Newshour. You can find me online at Cameron Cowan on Twitter and Instagram, facebook.com/Cameron L. Cowan on Facebook, and at Cameron Journal on TikTok, which is always fun. And don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter, CameronJournal.substack.com or CameronJournal.com/newsletter. And I will see you all next Monday for this show, the Cameron Journal Newshour. But before then, I'll see you on Wednesday on The Living Joke with Will and Connor. We have a lot of fun stuff to talk about this week. And when I say fun stuff, I mean the things that we'll figure out tomorrow that we're going to talk about. And we're going to have a grand old time. So thank you all so much for bearing with me this evening. Thank you all so much for being a part of the Cameron Journal family. And I will see you next week on the Cameron Journal Newshour. Thank you so much. Good night.